Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. South Korea's Yoon administration is revisiting two human rights issues involving North Korea. There was a controversy over how the previous Moon administration handled these cases. First, the case of a South Korean man killed by North Korean soldiers, and second, the case of two North Korean defectors who were sent back to North Korea. Today, we'll discuss about where the South Korean government is headed in its human rights policy.
우리 헌법에 따라서 우리 대한민국의 국민으로 간주가 되는데 복송시킨 거에 대해서는 많은 국민들이 좀 의아해하고
South Korea has an excellent legal system. The individuals can be put on trial in that more balanced and appropriate way of handling it.
In the studio with me is Robert King. Ambassador King served as a United States Special Envoy for North Korea human rights issues for nearly 8 years from 2009 to 2017. Also joining me is Greg Skalatu. Mr. Skalatu is the Executive Director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the show. Good to have you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We will start talking about a South Korean man killed by North Korean soldiers on the sea in 2020. South Korea's Yoon Suk-yeol administration overturned the previous Moon Jae-in government's finding that the man attempted to defect to North Korea. The bereaved family are asking for the full disclosure of the information surrounding the man's death. And President Yoon said his administration will do according to the law. Ambassador King, do you agree that the more information should have been and should be disclosed?
There's always value in having information. In a case like this where there were questions, it certainly makes sense to open the record, go back and look at what happened, and establish clarity.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Skalatu, what kind of information do you think these bereaved family are seeking for?
All available information. The family must find out the truth. South Korea is a free country, a liberal democracy, and the people of South Korea deserve to know the truth. We have to remember that pursuant to the Constitution of the Republic of Korea, all Koreans are citizens of the Republic of Korea, and all Korean territory is territory of the Republic of Korea. These claims that that the victim was attempting to defect, in my view at the time, were meant to divert attention away from the main issue, which was the South Korean government failed to protect the personal safety and life of this gentleman who ended up being killed by the North Koreans who disposed of the body in the most gruesome kind of way, as we all recall. Mm-hmm. So far, most regrettably, the gravest threat to the sovereignty of the Republic of Korea and the safety of the people of South Korea is the Kim regime in the north. Mm-hmm. Of course, we all hope for peace, reconciliation, eventually unification, but as of now, the South Korean has that obligation of protecting the safety, the personal safety and life of all Koreans.
Ambassador King, do you agree that South Korean government was trying to divert the attention from their failure?
It's hard to tell. That's the difficulty when information isn't disclosed. Mm-hmm. When information is not disclosed, people make up all sorts of possibilities and one doesn't know what happened. So I think the best way to deal with an issue like that is to provide the full information that's available, make sure that everyone sees what's out there, and hopefully it will resolve the questions. Mm-hmm. The lack of information was the problem. If government doesn't provide full information, if there's always the assumption that the government is trying to cover something up. And that's why disclosure is always the best way to deal with problems like that. The fact that it's now being raised again is only a clear indication that is the case. The issue is being raised by the Yoon administration because they want to contrast what they are doing with the previous administration. And this is part of an effort to say we're more concerned about human rights, and therefore we're going to reopen this case, we're going to reopen other cases, we're going to deal with human rights in a more open, transparent way. And I think that's, doing it at the very beginning of the administration the way they're doing is an attempt to say, we're different, we're not going to do it the same way, and you can believe what you hear from us.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Scarlatti, what about you? What was the main problem you saw when this was happening?
A lot was sacrificed under the previous administration of President Moon for the sake of reconciliation and rapprochement with the Kim regime of North Korea. Now, what we share with our friends, allies, and partners in South Korea, and President Biden has made it clear that these shared values are key to our alliances. What we share are precisely these values. And human rights are a central part of these values that we share with our allies. And we have very high expectations that things will get better. And South Korea will become ever more involved in protecting not only the human rights, lives, and personal safety of Koreans living in the South, but also those living in the North.
Ambassador, did previous South Korean administration, did they put too much priority on the relationship with North Korea in sacrifice of the values such as human rights?
I would have preferred to see the previous administration give more attention and focus to human rights. Human rights is an important part of the policy with North Korea. It's one of the main distinctions between North and South. South Korean people have expectations for human rights, for access to information, for being able to understand what their government is doing. And I think it's important that be done. I wouldn't want to specifically criticize any administration, but...
I understand. The South Korean government overturned the earlier finding that the man was attempted to defect to North Korea. And Mr. Scarlatti, why was this issue? I'm wondering, why was this even important when man was killed?
Even if the man had attempted to defect to North Korea, would that have meant that he had waived the protection of the Constitution of the Republic of Korea, of the laws, the applicable laws of the Republic of Korea, of international instruments that the Republic of Korea has ratified, and why not, even the DPRK, some of them. So I would say that was not necessarily relevant. What was relevant was that what happened was a crime. It was a blatant violation of applicable South Korean law. And it was a blatant violation of applicable international human rights documents.
I mean, the question is, what happened? Why did it happen? Not what his motives are. You're always on shaky ground when you try to explain someone's motives.
Yes.
And you don't have the person there to give his or her own interpretation.
Well, folks have defected back and forth, especially from the north going to the south. Some of them, very few of them, have decided to go back to the north. Again, if the citizen of the Republic of Korea, for any reason, decides to defect to the north, it doesn't mean that the punishment deserved in this case is death under the most gruesome of circumstances.
We'll move on to the next case. This is what happened in 2019. The repatriation of the two North Korean fishermen who sailed into South Korean waters. They were known to have expressed their intention to defect to South Korea. Ambassador Kim, how do you look back at this case?
I think this was the case where members of the crew, other members of the crew had been murdered.
Yes, that's what the South Korean government said, yes.
What the problem here is, murder under any circumstance is a heinous crime and should be punished. The real difficulty is the North Korean fishermen were returned against their will to North Korea. This is a situation where we all know what will happen to someone who defects, whether they've killed anyone or not. What the South Korean government should have done is they should have looked into the circumstances, made a determination based on South Korean law enforcement, which is far superior to what you're going to get in North Korea, and decided what the cause was, what the problem was, and how the individuals involved should have been treated. There was no effort to do that. The way the case was handled was particularly poor. The individuals involved were returned. The South Korean government attempted to cover up the fact that they were being returned, and it was only a mistaken message that leaked, the press found out. Otherwise, there would have been no information known about what happened. The way it was handled was atrocious, and I think the South Korean government would have been wise to have looked at the information, made a determination based on South Korean rule of law as to whether there was a problem here in terms of what had happened on board the ship. Because of differences in how they would be treated in North Korea and South Korea, they probably should have been handled as a case in South Korea, in the South Korean courts. I have great confidence in the South Korean courts in terms of reaching decisions in cases like this. So I think it was very badly handled from the very beginning.
The Moon administration claimed they have committed a heinous crime, murdering 16 people, as Ambassador said. Even if this was true, was it still wrong for the South Korean government to send them back?
North Koreans who escape to South Korea have this minimum expectation that they will enjoy the protection of the law in South Korea. There will be due process, there will be rule of law. That didn't happen in this case. And for a crime as heinous as the authorities claimed it was, barely a couple of days to conduct an investigation does not really qualify as due process or rule of law. In my view, no decision is exclusively legal. There are legal, ethical, moral, political elements to any legal decision. In this particular case, it seems that the political prevailed over all other considerations, again, for the sake of perhaps appeasing the North Korean regime in hopes of rapprochement and reconciliation at the very top.
Ambassador, when this incident happened in South Korea, the South Korean people's thoughts, opinions were quite divided because they were allegedly criminals. What would have been really right approach?
First thing, not covered up. Covering it up, I think, was the first big mistake. Treating it openly, treating it publicly would have been a much better way to do it. The South Korean government should have held an investigation under South Korean court procedures and investigatory procedures, and it should have been looked at, and the information should have become public. If the facts of the case are true, it's obviously a heinous crime, and the individuals involved should have been punished very severely. But to return them to North Korea doesn't assure that there's going to be a proper investigation. And so I think the decision to do that was where the problem was. The basic thing, and I think the reason why these two issues are being raised, is the current government in South Korea is attempting to make the point that the situation will be different with regard to human rights. And I think that's the most important thing in terms of raising it now. When Foreign Minister Pak was here last week, he met with a number of people here in Washington, and the remarks that he gave on that occasion highlighted the fact that South Korea was concerned about the human rights situation in North Korea, and that greater attention, greater focus would be given to the human rights issues. I think that's the message, and raising these issues only serves to highlight this by picking two of the very controversial, high-profile cases and saying, we would have done it differently. I hope this reflects a fundamental change.
Because these two issues were such hotly debated issues back then, so now South Korea's opposition party argues bringing up both these issues is politically motivated. Mr. Scarlett, what's your thought on this? I mean, they're claiming it is a political attack on the previous administration.
With the Yoon government in place now, it is extraordinarily important to see a North Korean human rights policy in South Korea. South Korea hasn't really had a North Korean human rights policy since 2017. South Korea has not had an ambassador at large for North Korean human rights since Ambassador Lee Jong-hun stepped down in the fall of 2017. Okay, we're not spotless here either. We have not had a special envoy for North Korean human rights since Ambassador King stepped down in January 2017. That is 6.5 years. And also, I would say that we haven't really had a coherent North Korean human rights policy, especially since Ambassador King stepped down. I think there is a lot of work to do in terms of retaking the high ground we once held at the United Nations as friends, allies, and partners of South Korea, Japan, the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, and others.
Can we separate human rights from becoming political issues?
Human rights is a political issue. And fortunately it is, because it does put pressure on governments who don't observe human rights. No, I think it's unfortunate that it's become a political issue in South Korea. And it hasn't become a political issue because of the changes that have taken place over the last couple of weeks. It's an issue because because there have been changes over the last several years. I think the same thing is true in the United States. We're certainly, we also have the same problem, as Greg mentioned. And I'm disappointed that the Biden administration has not acted more quickly to appoint the Special Envoy for North Korea Human Rights in the United States. It's helpful to have someone focusing on those issues. This is something that should be done. This administration, the Biden administration, has indicated that it intends to do this, but we're now a year and a half into it. It's well past time when something should happen.
Yeah. Meanwhile, at the U.S. Congress, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission held a hearing on South Korea's refugee policy. The commission says South Korea has one of the lowest rates among the developed countries in terms of granting refugee status. And of course, the topic of the refugees from North Korea or North Korean defectors was also discussed in depth. Mr. Scarlett, why was this hearing held?
The Tom Lantos Commission has had a commendable history of paying attention to this particular issue of North Korean refugees, the need to protect them in South Korea and elsewhere. So I would speculate that it is a message relayed to our friends and partners in South Korea that this is an issue that truly matters. Of course, the numbers have declined dramatically because of COVID, because of draconian restrictions in the border areas, draconian restrictions imposed internally as well in North Korea. But nevertheless, this continues to be a slow motion refugee crisis, sometimes outcompeted by other massive refugee crises in the Mediterranean basin, in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Nevertheless, we must remind the people of North Korea that they're not forgotten.
Ambassador, U.S. Congress talking about South Korea's refugee policy. Is it common to talk about the human rights issues in advanced countries like South Korea?
Congress talks about anything and everything. I think that one issue that I would add is that South Korea has a very good record in terms of its efforts to deal with refugees from North Korea. But South Korea, I think, probably needs to look at its record on dealing with refugees from other parts of the world. South Korea is a country that is wealthy. They have a great need for labor. South Korea would be a good place for refugees from other areas. And I think South Korea ought to maybe look at its refugee policy not just as a North Korean issue, but as an issue, a humanitarian issue that deals with other parts of the world.
There is a particular case that has been ongoing for a while now. Members of a Christian church from China who have sought refuge in South Korea. They're on Jeju Island right now. Of course, we know that South Korea has the second largest Christian population in Asia after the Philippines. This is pretty much part of the core values of South Korea. Their asylum application was denied. Their appeal was denied, as far as I know. We have colleagues who are following this issue very closely. As Ambassador King said, South Korea is a highly developed country. South Korea is fully capable of looking after refugees other than the brethren, the brothers and sisters coming from the north. If I may add just one more thing.
Sure.
Of course, we are all from advanced countries. Advanced countries never claim to have a perfect human rights record. It is only the human rights violators who claim to have a perfect human rights record. We identify the issues, we work on the issues, we make things better, we improve our own civil rights and human rights situation. I believe that this is something that the United States and the Republic of Korea also have in common. This never-ending struggle to make things better. And at the end of the day, we succeed.
My last question. Actually, it's kind of related to what Mr. Scarlett said, but Ambassador, what can South Korea do to make it better?
You know, South Korea is a country that has had an exemplary record of making great progress from where it was at the end of the Korean War. And South Korea has played an important role internationally. Former South Korean foreign minister was head of the United Nations, Secretary General of the United Nations for 2 terms. South Korea has played an important role in the UN. South Korea needs to continue to do that and continue to play an active role internationally, not just on narrow South Korean issues.
Right. Mr. Scarlett, is there any, I want to ask your last thought too, but is there any particular area that you want to see improvement in South Korea's human rights policy?
Well, I would like South Koreans, the people of South Korea, to remember that the reason behind their tremendous success has been this particular set of values. The belief in free markets, in hard work, in entrepreneurship, in human rights. Economic success is not possible without respect for human rights. And of course, we know that our friends in South Korea will always remember the value of the U.S.-South Korea alliance, an alliance that has evolved in many different kind of ways. And we do hope that values will be remembered and cherished. And I do know that the people of South Korea, younger generations included as well, will remember those values that lie at the very core of the identity of the Republic of Korea and her people.
South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol is taking steps very different from his predecessor in his approach toward human rights issues involving the North Korean regime. And U.S. President Joe Biden has been stressing that his administration puts human rights at the heart of the U.S. foreign policy. How these two leaders will be able to work together in the future about the human rights issues in North Korea and other places will be something to watch. Ambassador King and Mr. Scarlett, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.